Okay, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for the online Minerals to Metals Forum. Just some quick housekeeping. Please mute your mic and turn off your video. During the discussion, please either type your question in the chat box or raise your hand before unmuting and speaking to the group. We will have a Q&A session. If you have any questions during the presentations, please enter them in the chat with the speaker you are directing the question to. Please note that this forum is recorded and will be made available to the public. If you do not want to be seen or heard, but want to participate, please note you can make yourself anonymous by changing your name and leaving your questions in the chat. If you have any issues, please send me a private message in the chat. You can change the recipient from everyone to A. Charlotte, and I can try and help you with what I can from this side. For the first half an hour, we will be doing presentations, and the second half will consist of Q&A session. I'm now going to hand over to Thandazile Moyo, who will introduce the topic for today's forum and our speakers.
Thank you very much, Aisha. I hope everybody can hear me. As Aisha has said, I am Thandazile Moyo. I am with the Minerals to Metals initiative at the University of Cape Town, and today we are looking at waste, repurposing, recycling. And we have a panel today over which we're looking at waste under two particular themes. We're looking at mine wastes, and we are also looking at electronic waste. And to introduce our panel today, I'll start off with Jennifer Broadhurst. Jenny is Jenny is an associate professor with Minerals to Metals and works on research and capacity development in minerals beneficiation. And with Jenny on the same topic of mine waste is Helene-Marie, who is a PhD student with Minerals to Metals, looking at valorization and risk reduction of sulfide fine coal mine waste from its early stage to the stage of technology transfer. And then as we move on with the topics looking at electronic waste, we have Professor Schenck, who is the HOD of Social Work at the University of the Western Cape, and she is also the SACHI Chair of Waste and Society. We will also be joined by Susanne Karcher, who is the co-founder of African Circular Economy Network and is the director of the Southern African E-Waste Alliance. And last but not least, we have Zaynab Sadan, who is a project officer with WWF, and she is a graduate of chemical engineering UCT, having done her master's thesis with us on electronic waste recycling. She will speak more to the work she is doing. So I will ask Jenny to give an overview of mine waste and introduce the work that we're doing in that sector and just give topical issues on mine waste.
And I will unvideo myself. There we go. Can everybody see me and hear me? Okay, so I'm just going to really open up the discussion a little bit around this whole concept of waste, what the problems are and what we can possibly do about it. As most of you are probably aware, the primary mineral sector generates large quantities of solid waste, and these can vary from your waste rocks, your overburden and tailings during ore extraction and primary processing. And these are generally your large volume wastes, but we also have then your leach residues, your slags, your dusts that are generated during metallurgical processing, and even your slimes and sludges from the actual refining and wastewater treatment processes. But today what I'd really like to focus on is the tailings, the waste rocks, also known as overburden, that are generally considered to be your large volume mine wastes, and which typically can account for anything from 70 to more than 99% of your actual ore body, which sometimes raises the question as to whether the primary mineral sector is rather a waste generation rather than a metal or value generation industry. And these wastes are typically disposed of to land in the form of tailings impoundments and waste rock dumps, which can pose a significant and often irreversible risk to the surrounding environment. And I'm sure that you have all heard about the Brumadinho tailings disaster in Brazil in January last year, which caused mass devastation and killed over 250 people. But although, yes, the geotechnical stability of these tailings dumps is of paramount importance, and the collapse of these tailings dumps can be very dramatic and create a lot of media attention, it is really the continuous generation of contaminated leachate and dust which poses the most serious environmental risk over the long term. And studies that we have done in the Mpumalanga coal fields, the gold field of the Broadhurst, South Africa, as well as the Zambian copper belt, bear testimony to the sometimes devastating effects that these waste-related environmental impacts can have on the quality of life, the health, and even the livelihoods of surrounding communities. So we have seen in the last decade, 1 or 2 decades, that the mining industry is really making a concerted effort to minimize these risks, mainly by focusing on improved design, management, and rehabilitation of mine dumps. The problem is that these interventions are not consistently applied, and even in the best cases, they have yet to be proven effective in generating what we would call a walkaway situation. This is a self-sustaining site that doesn't need additional intervention over the long term. And in many cases, these remediation type of strategies are not sufficient to address long-term environmental degradation. And I think we've seen that history has shown time and time again that trying to separate mine dumps from people over the long term is virtually impossible. So there's a good chance that these dumps will eventually be excavated in the future, and this will then re-expose the waste body to these elements. So in addition to the environmental and socio-economic impacts, these dumps also represent a loss of natural resources, and this includes mineral resources, which have now been excavated and processed, as well as land and potentially usable land and water. A lot of people don't realize, but tailings, your conventional tailings, are the biggest water sink on a mine site and often represent 70% of the loss or consumption of water on a mine. So an alternative approach then to treating waste as sort of unwanted or displaced material that requires disposal is to consider mine waste as a secondary resource, which can be reallocated as feedstock for other uses and purposes, thus simultaneously removing the long-term risks that are associated with these mine dumps. So this type of approach is also commonly referred to as valorization approaches. Is consistent with the principles of resource efficiency, industrial ecology, as well as the circular economy, all of which call for us to minimize waste burden through enhanced reuse and recycling of waste materials. The reallocation of mine waste also provides the opportunity to use the land more productively, and also potentially contribute to economic development by creating business and employment opportunities. So studies within Minerals to Metals and the Center for Bioprocess Engineering Research and Center for Minerals Research at UCT have shown, and there are a couple of other groups around the world that have also done some work at UQ and in Canada, Morocco. We're in touch with these groups of research groups of researchers that are working around this area. And they have shown that there are a number of options for the repurposing or reuse of mine waste. And these can have significant environmental and economic benefits. So for instance, we can use the mine waste to backfill mines, to fabricate soils or ameliorate soils. We can use them in construction, or even to manufacture niche chemicals and byproducts such as pigments, coagulants for waste treatments, sulfuric acid, and there are more. Our work has, however, indicated that despite these opportunities and the apparent benefits, quite extensive direct and indirect benefits, the commercial implementation of these mine waste valorization or repurposing options is currently significantly constrained by both, particularly in South Africa, by both technical and non-technical factors. And these factors have been explored in greater detail by Helene-Marie as part of her doctoral studies with Minerals to Metals and the SIBA research group. So I think on that note, I'm going to hand over to Helene-Marie to talk a little bit about what we have found in terms of these constraining factors. Thank you.
Cool. Good afternoon, everyone. So I'll be talking about some research that I've done a while back, as Jenny has said. It's focused specifically on the transfer of waste valorization or waste reuse technologies to the South African coal mining industry. This is supposed to be an informal introduction, so I'll quickly skip through the results of my study. The big takeaways that I would like to leave you with is that mines aren't necessarily the best organizations to partner with on implementation of these technologies. Better organizations may be original equipment manufacturers or even commercial waste processors. The other big idea is that the implementation landscape is complex and one needs to understand it in order to do technology transfer well. I've looked at it under the headings of technology development, economics, regulatory landscape, and corporate values. So that is what you can expect me to talk about. So for all of the reasons that Jenny has just mentioned, reusing mine waste is a good idea. But for this to happen, innovative technologies must be developed and implemented. The question that my research has tried to answer is what research institutions such as UCT need to do in order to achieve this. Now I'm going to attempt to share my screen. Ooh. Thank you. Oh, no, not quite yet. There we go. There we go. Okay, so this is a multi-stage separation process, which is basically like a precursor process for reusing these mine wastes. And you can see stage 1, separation. You first separate out the residual product in the waste, which in this case is a coal product. And then from there, from that, tailings is then separated into a sulfide lean tailings stream, which is hopefully benign. And lab work at UCT has indicated that that stream might be useful as a basis for soil fabrication that can be used in remediating or rehabilitating mines post-mining, or perhaps for blinding or for co-disposal with coarse coal waste. And there are other options for using that as well, such as backfill or construction materials. Then the desulfurization concentrate, that is the stuff that contains the acid rock drainage generating component. And part of my work has looked at finding different ways for applying that material. But that is not what this presentation is about. So yeah, commercialization and implementation of these technologies and solutions are imperative if we're going to have an impact. So the way that I've gone about doing this is I've interviewed stakeholders, 15 from the coal industry, and 1 executive from a related commodity who has successfully implemented waste valorization technology. So you can see we've got a couple of technology implementers, an interesting group, some coal major executives. I was very, very happy to find some coal junior executives to talk with, some consultants to the coal mining industry, and then some researchers active in coal-related research. And just before I get into the nitty-gritties, just to remind you that technology transfer is a multi-stage process. It's a complex process, and there are a number of actors involved. So when I say implemented, these are the people who do the trials and is part of the adoption. When I say the disseminator, that is basically universities or research institutions, and then universities can also form part of the developer role in this whole process. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen in a minute. There we go. And yeah, so I'm going to start with what really surprised me most. So I was fully expecting to see that mines were going to be the preferred stakeholders to partner with for developing technology and then implementing it. And universities used to partner with mines for technology development, but this is not really the case anymore. The business model of mines is producing mining ores, and this has led them to disinvest in specialized technical roles and outsource the technical aspects to trusted original equipment manufacturers or other consultants. Coal mines simply don't have the dissemination networks, the experience, or the corporate structures set up in a way to market and sell technologies such as these. As one executive noted, he said, "We're not interested in IP, we're not interested in widgets. We're interested in making money. And we don't make money by honing widgets or selling widgets even. That said, the waste still belongs to the mines, and they do know their waste best. So they will still need to be involved in the process, but perhaps not quite as implementer and adopter. So if mines are not going to implement, who will? According to this work, this role is likely to be fulfilled by the producers of the technology, original equipment manufacturers, or commercial waste processors. Original equipment manufacturers already have the business strategy. They already have the experience, the technical skills, the contact, and the credibility with industry to be able to commercialize technology successfully. We don't know what these companies' appetite for partnership with research organizations is, though, since they weren't included in the research design. Alternatively, commercial waste processors could be approached. An example of a commercial waste processor is Sylvania, which is active in the platinum and chrome industries. So now I'm going to move on to the barriers and enablers component of the results. And I think the first set of barriers and enablers I'm going to discuss under technology development heading. So for the technology aspect, I don't think the outcomes would surprise anyone. The technology risk and long-term development timelines associated with early stage technology are important barriers. Establishing and demonstrating viability to the industry in as tangible a way as possible was considered of first importance. This might mean having to have pilot plants, test sites. It also means having organizations being able to test their technology on the technology on their own material and to see the results. It also means making the most of things like workshops and technical consultations and lab visits and other ways of communicating with those who are likely to make the decisions regarding the technology implementation and adoption. The previous point about the erosion of technical expertise at mines will influence who that communication is directed at, though. Something specific to mine waste reuse that was mentioned was that the technology will really need to show itself as being robust and able to handle variability in feed material, since waste is inherently variable and often quite poorly characterized. Moving on to the economic barriers and drivers, unsurprisingly, a convincing business case was considered a very important driver. Some respondents even started the interview with an exposition of the importance of a business case before I could ask the first question. The importance of a good business case is amplified, though, in the South African coal mining industry for a number of reasons. Scale-up is an expensive process, and funding for technology scale-up in South Africa is scarce. Also, mining is a capital-intensive business and consequently quite risk-averse. If you get something wrong on a R1 billion plant, it's not easy to recover from that. So they like to play it safe. An internal rate of return between 15 and 30%, depending on the organization, was considered important. But I mean, there's always the response to that you might miss the possibility of gaining other goods rather than financial if you only look at internal rate of returns. But that is what it seems the industry is looking at right now. A waste-specific issue that was mentioned is that even though tailings deposits are capable of severely polluting the surrounding environment, they might actually not be sufficiently large to achieve economies of scale that is needed to produce the kind of returns that mines or original equipment manufacturers might be requiring to proceed with the project. So that the scale of the tailings dumps might be a problem. And a problem specific to coal projects is that funding worldwide is scarce due to the implementation of the agreements between banks, such as the Equator Principles. The Equator Principles specifically require that projects meet certain sustainability criteria, and they have a very detailed assessment process. And this has meant that coal mining projects, on the whole, suffer from a dearth of funding, and they really do struggle finding funding for their projects. On the regulatory landscape, legislation can be a great driver for the implementation of waste reuse technologies, as when they make disposal of waste in traditional ways more expensive, which is what has happened. However, uncertain, confusing, changing regulatory environments can be a barrier, since companies take a wait-and-see approach. Lots of change and some confusion has characterized the South African mining and waste legislation in the recent past. Also, poor or uneven enforcement can hinder implementation for the same reason. People rather wait and see whether implementation is really necessary. In South Africa, government agencies have also been reported to be unsupportive, and many respondents thought that legislation places unreasonable burdens on mines. For instance, some respondents thought that the Water Act could render the industry unprofitable if it was implemented fully. Lastly, corporate values. On the softer side, respondents indicated that the coal industry feels under pressure and undervalued. Pressures included depleting coal reserves, increasingly onerous legal requirements, funding issues, and looming social and environmental liabilities, among other issues. On the positive side of the pressure aspect is that companies are also feeling pressure from environmental groups and communities. One respondent put it this way. He said, "The public doesn't like acid water. They don't like pollution. If it's screened on carte blanche, people see it. And then there's a lot of pressure to reduce this pollution and footprints." This pressure might work in favor of implementing waste reuse technologies. Lastly, the perception in some parts of the industry was that waste is something without value or even dangerous. And that may need to be challenged for waste valorization technologies to be taken seriously. And another perception that needs to be challenged is that waste valorization in a coal mining context simply refers to removing the residual coal and selling that. And it doesn't actually extend to reusing the bulk mineral waste. So that would also need to be challenged. And yeah, with that, that's the end of my my summary of the work that I've done. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helene-Marie and Jenny, for that. So with that said, I would want to pose a challenge to the audience that's listening and to some of the presenters that are going to talk today. In fact, it was something that was posed by Johan Peterson in preparation for this session, where he basically asked, is recycling worth it? So after today's sessions, at the end of this forum session, if you could answer that question for me, maybe comment or raise your hands, what your take home is it economically worth it, environmentally, and also looking at it from an energy perspective, do you think recycling is worth it? So with that said, I will move on to the session where we are talking all things electronic waste recycling. And I would want to give you a bit of statistics for that, to put that into context. Electronic waste, also referred to as waste electronic and electric equipment. So globally, we projected to produce about 50 million tons of electronic waste this year. Those figures stood at about 14 million tons in 1992 and 24 million by 2002, and here we are today looking at about 50 million tons. And to explain that away, I would say, look at your archives. What do you have stored? Where is your old phone, your old laptop, your children's old toys? All of those contribute to electronic waste streams, be it your microwave, your refrigerator, in all forms, anything through which an electric current flows. When you are done with it, it becomes a waste. It makes up the waste, the electronic waste streams. So about 2 million of what's produced, the waste streams volumes produced globally, 2 million of that are from Africa, with very poor stats being recorded in Africa in terms of accounting for our waste flows. You find that in South Africa, if you follow through literature, you actually cannot find exact values or values that agree with each other on the tonnages of electronic waste that's produced, with some reporting as low as 76,000 to about 381,000 tons of electronic waste per year being projected for 2020 alone. And globally, what we know is about 20% of our electronic waste streams are recycled, with South Africa recycling between 7 and 12%, and the rest reporting to landfill, if not remaining in different warehouses or the drawers at home where you're keeping that old charger. So basically, we are looking at a waste stream that doesn't just report to landfill, but also needs to be unlocked in order to be accessed for recycling. And when we look at South Africa, about 25% of the waste stream that's recycled actually comes from informal recyclers. And I think Rini will speak to that from her work with informal waste collectors, because I'm sure most of you every morning you've seen that occasional waste picker digging through your bin, picking up different forms of valuables. So that's actually an interesting point to look at, where our value chain actually starts when we talk electronic waste recycling. And when we're looking at waste electronic and electric equipment, we're looking at different value fractions. We have the printed circuit boards, which I most often spoken about, because that's what are most what we call cherry pickers would go for, because that's where most of the value sits when we are looking at recycling electronic waste. That's where a lot of the valuable metals sit, and that makes for a good business case for recyclers. But we also have what has stood the test of time, where we have seen people recycling copper cables, copper wiring, and there's steel, there's plastic fractions, and there's phosphor powders from our fluorescent lamps, which a source of rare earth metals. And to the best of my knowledge, in South Africa, we still haven't established a technology for recovering those rare earth powders, but actually the one recycler that's known at country level still stores those powders in hope of establishing a technology to then be able to recycle and gain monetary value from that. And there's other fractions as well, such as batteries, etc., etc. So to kick off our conversation today, we will start with Susanne. I've already given a brief introduction, but to those of you that are joining us now, Susanne is the co-founder of the African Circular Economy Network, and she is the director of the Southern African E-Waste Alliance. And I have, and I think as Minerals to Metals, we've had the pleasure of working with Susanne through some of our research, where she has introduced us to a lot of different recyclers at different levels, and introduced us to what the business case looks like in terms of interacting with different role players in the electronic waste recycling industry in Africa, and particularly in Southern Africa. Susanne, over to you.
Thank you so much. Can everyone hear me? Can everyone see me? Yeah, okay, great. It's a new way of talking to people. It's a bit less intimidating. I see 47 participants, but all I do is really stare at my screen. So let's get going. So as Thandazile, as you mentioned, I am heading the Southern African E-Waste Alliance. In a nutshell, the objective of the E-Waste Alliance is to create a blueprint for the safe and responsible collection and treatment of all electronic waste in Southern Africa. And my task today is really to talk about how can we build a sustainable e-waste industry in Africa, and give some insights in what's going on in South Africa, available support systems for new businesses, challenges and opportunities in that wider space, and the status quo. So to understand where the sustainability hotspots are, you have to understand the South African e-waste value chain. And at the heart of this, and that's like any other global value chain on e-waste, really you would look at collection, at dismantling, at pre-processing, that would be mostly concerned with mechanical processing, and then end processing, which is then typically any form of metallurgical processing, so hydrometallurgical processing, pyrometallurgical, or chemical electrochemical metallurgical processing. And so for each of them, it's really important to understand how policy development can either drive or actually kill aspirations of those respective value chain stakeholders. And, you know, the balance obviously is we need to create a sound system in terms of environmental health and safety protection, where the actual impacts are created, where the actual risks are arising. But at the same time, we do not want to over-regulate. So it's very important that our future development and policy is taking care of what is everyone doing and what are actually the risks associated with certain activities and certain operations. And I think South Africa is at the moment quite famous for actually over-regulating quite a lot. And that is the experience that I can share with you from the Southern African E-Waste Alliance perspective, where we work with recyclers. Sure, we have this handful of really big recyclers, the names you might be very well familiar with, like Reclite, like Desco, like Universal Recycling, just to name a few. And those are basically recyclers that have all the systems in place, they have all the compliance documents in place, and they have what is called the waste management license. And the waste management license has shown that this is a key requirement that is really causing a lot of problems for a lot of people, because it's linked to the listed activities. So if you are processing more than a ton of electronic waste on a daily basis, you actually are asked to have this waste management license, and it's expensive and it takes time. So a lot of operators we know are trying to fly under the radar. And I've worked quite intensely with UCT already, especially with Aisha, unpacking that issue and saying, perhaps what we need to start motivating for our government is the idea that we should develop norms and standards. We have already norms and standards for what's termed general waste, for the collection, treatment, processing of general waste. So perhaps we need to now have norms and standards for hazardous waste that really would then define for certain activities what's possible and what's not. And one of the key things that inspired us was to look into Ghana, because Ghana has developed technical guidelines where really different value chain stakeholders are described as tiers. And if you look, for example, and I'm sure Rennie will tell us more about it, when you look, for example, in the beginning of the value chain where the collectors would be, so the people that reclaim, that recover from households or business electronic waste, you will find in those technical guidelines there's very little required for those people. They have to register, at the Ghana government, provide the GPS coordinates and things like that. But otherwise, they are left alone because the Ghana government has understood that the efficiency of e-waste collection from the informal sector is unsurpassed. So you don't want to actually stifle this type of thing. And the same goes for manual dismantling. There is a little bit more of legal requirements, but someone who has a screwdriver in their hand and wants to dismantle some electronic waste is actually not over-regulated. There are not any limits. It starts becoming obviously more interesting when you go into the recycling domain. So there you have then your clear requirements for depollution and for all kind of other things. So what Ghana understood very well is link the actual risk to the amount of legislation and compliance requirements. And I think that's a key lesson to be learned that we need to do. And then we can also create a level playing field, and that should provide a chance also more for small, medium enterprise development. I have just signed now also with the University of Johannesburg a working agreement where we really want to push now for the education of small businesses on e-waste, like basic kind of lessons to be learned. And we are also, the e-waste alliance is also in the process now to develop for its members a certification and verification system that when someone comes and say, I want to be part of SAIVA, we look at what are they doing? We then providing a list of all the documents that are required to be compliant. And then those compliance documents are weighed. So we find a way to be able to grade our recyclers in future in a star-based kind of system, which would make it very much easier also to see exactly where the recyclers are and also create a strong motivation for the recyclers to move up, to get more stars. And the thought behind it is, if we can develop a system like this, first for the SAIVA and then for the wider South Africa, with the ongoing, and I'll share this with you, development of an EPR framework for e-waste, the obligated parties, which are the producers, they could then look at this recycling framework and say, okay, the EPR money, they could get indication of what kind of recyclers are out there and how could they support through EPR funds certain types of recyclers that are on certain levels of being evolved. The other people, another observation that we've made, which is important, you might remember all the FAKISA, the operational FAKISA project from DEF. And one of the key deliverables in this FAKISA for chemicals and waste is really to unlock government stockpiles. So it has been understood that our government has huge stockpiles of electronic waste and that they need to be unlocked and then responsibly taken care of. But I also have evidence of government organizations that are shopping around, literally shopping around, phoning me up and saying, we have this e-waste, where do we find the highest bidder? Who's buying that e-waste from us? We want money for it. So please, government has to walk the talk in terms of actually being ethical about this and understanding that most of what you find in electronic waste is a liability, a financial liability. So yes, you have your, as Thandazile say, your cherries, your printed circuit boards, but if you look at the vast majority of the constituents of e-waste, a lot of them are actually serious liabilities. And that's why we are of the opinion that recyclers do not want to pay anyone for the e-waste, but the e-waste should be provided to them for free, or they should even get paid if there are enough liability fractions in there. Moving on in the value chain, on the end processing side, what would also be really important for South Africa is that we increase our end processing capacity here in South Africa. At the moment, we have a situation where we do have mechanical shredding of printed circuit boards. That's what the big recyclers do. There is some sort of concentrating of the value fractions, which is still a bit of an IP situation. And then literally all the stuff gets sent overseas. So it would end up at a Umicore or a Boliden. We really don't have end processing facilities, which means that the valuables are actually leaving the country, which doesn't make any sense. So we need to develop local capacity for end processing. That's another key point. I just want to share with you quickly some of the latest developments also in terms of policy. You might be well aware that there was initially the demand from the minister at that time, the one who died, Edna Maleva, to develop industrial waste management plans and electronic waste, and the lighting industry was one of the sectors that had to do this. And in December last year, that was scratched. So the whole idea of developing those plans by the industry was abolished, with the understanding and the explanation that this initial Section 28 process would have actually meant that the government would have had to demand an industry-managed system, a government-managed system. And that caused a huge bone of contention over the last 3 years, that industry felt that government wants industry to pay for the take back and recycling of e-waste, but not manage the system itself. And that was a huge, huge problem. And the industry, specifically the packaging industry, was also very verbal that they're not going to play ball with this type of idea. Now the game has changed. Now the minister has said, that was last year December, that she intends instead to enforce Section 18 of the Waste Act, which is actually concerned with introducing of the extended producer responsibility principle. We were initially all very annoyed about it because a lot of work went down the drain last 4 years developing those plans, and now all those plans were shelved. But everyone came around quite quickly to understand it's actually a good idea, because this EPA framework development now really offers what we need, which means that the industry is obligated, the producers are obligated, but they are also allowed to manage that system. And the status quo there is that we had workshops with DEF, which is now the DEA, but it's the same organization, the same department, DEF, Department of Environmental Affairs and Forestry and Fisheries. In February, they held a workshop and they put everyone together in one room, the lighting people and the e-waste people, and set us in 2 sessions to break down what is required in our respective frameworks for EPR. And the SAIVA is supporting one PRO directly, which is the E-Waste Recycling Authority. So we sit down now on a weekly basis developing this framework, and I'm sure the lighting industry is doing exactly the same, and I'm sure other PROs that are linked to e-waste are also doing the same. So the idea is we develop voluntarily a framework that we will then, after this whole COVID is over, that we will submit to the government and say this is what we have in mind, and hopefully the government would then support the suggested elements in the EPR framework that we have on offer. Key strategies obviously will be to develop collection centers at municipal level. That's very important that the EPR funds reach to this. So financing, collection, take back, treatment, and also education. That is very important, that this is the obligation. And what is nice about EPR is that it goes beyond just the end of pipe solution optimization, which means pick up, collect, treat. It actually has a clear element that's linked to the circular economy, because it's also concerned with product innovation and product design. And if you look into Section 18, our minister can actually really push also the producers to provide evidence of product design considerations, which I think is quite exciting. So who else is there? What are other roles that are linked to a sustainable e-waste landscape? Again, going back to the value chain, there are 2 parties distinctly missing and never spoken about. And the one is the consumers. and the other ones is the retailers. They form exactly part of the value chain as well. So what is really important is that we have requirements in future that requires consumers to bring back. There needs to be a legal bring back obligation. So if we have all those nice collection centers that will be financed by the producers, there needs to be coupled a requirement for the consumers to really bring back. And that brings us to the retailers. The retailers are very often conspicuous, absent of any of those kind of discussions. But if you look at the international EPR systems, the retailers' requirements need to be to take back. So in other words, if someone sells you something, that person needs to also take back the stuff when it becomes electronic waste. So in a nutshell, governments need to create an enabling environment for all members in the value chain to collaborate and fulfill their potential role optimally. And they need to lead with a good example. They need to harmonize regulations also between government tiers. And I'm sure Rini will tell you more about it, but if we want to unlock the power of the informal sector, you know, the gatekeepers are actually the municipalities. So if we if we work with the municipalities, we need to make sure that we harmonize regulations that actually enable this. So, and also most important, enforce and get tough where needed. So if the producers go there, if they develop this EPR system, we need to know that our government responds to free riders. Free riders are companies that would circumvent paying into the PROs, and the government's role is actually to enforce the law and get tough on those type of free riders. Also getting tough on recyclers that deliberately violate regulations and damage the environment for the sake of creating more profits. Finally, South Africa is not an island. We must unlock the role of becoming a regional hub for e-waste treatment, not just in South Africa, but beyond. And then final, the mining industry is really fast asleep because, you know, if you think about it, that you have in a cell phone, perhaps certain metals concentrated 80 to 100 times more than in the earth. I really don't understand why the mining industry is not understanding that this is the business of tomorrow. And as we run out of primary resources, they should become experts in the recovery of secondary resources, and they're missing really the boat here. E-waste is a big, important technical nutrient. And if we want to start the circular economy debate in all honesty in South Africa, we should start talking using e-waste as a technical nutrient to make it happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susanne, and sorry to interject you. All right, so on that note, I see a lot of questions coming up here with Suzanne's name on them, and I want to encourage all the minerals to metals students who are online and working in this research space to look at those questions, and we do not necessarily get to have Suzanne respond to all of them, but to the up and coming experts in the field to actually take those on and respond. I will then ask Professor Rini Schenck to talk to us about waste and society and e-waste in that space. Rini, over to you.
Oh dear. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm somewhere, I can't, can you see me?
Not yet.
I can't start my video. Okay, let's see.
Oh, there you go.
See me. Okay, good afternoon. And thank you for inviting me to be part of this. I will be very short and then you can ask me questions. I'm going to talk, my position is I'm the chair in Waste and Society. So on the one hand, we're looking at human behavior and how people see waste, how they manage waste, what they do with their waste. But I think in terms of this discussion, one of our focus is to look at the value chain, the waste value chain, and where people fit into the waste value chain. But I think what is more important is that if we look at the value chain, the waste pickers and the informal economy, informal sector is the main drivers in South Africa and in all the other developing countries. They are the main drivers of the recycling sector in South Africa. Since I think in the 1990s, they started to emerge. I think if we look at our unemployment rate in South Africa, that is currently 29%. Our expanded rate is 38%, I think close to 40%, and our youth unemployment rate at the moment is 55%. So the informal sector is growing, and of course is to recycle is part of earning an income and making a living. It is currently estimated that 90% of the recycling in South Africa is happening via the informal sector. And I think why we are stressing this and why we did research on them is exactly to understand them, to see who are they, and make them part of the process. Susanne was now talking about certain decisions. We need to take back our cell phones. We need to take back our electronic waste. And yes, we should do that. But I think when it comes to our plans forward, it is important that the informal sector is part of the plans. Otherwise, we sidestep them, and it's actually to their detriment. Currently, there are movements in South Africa to organize the waste, because I think we've seen what happened with COVID-19. If you were following the news, they are in a very bad position because suddenly the lockdown, there's no income, they can't access the waste, the electronic waste, the normal household waste, they couldn't access anything. So they're very vulnerable. If anything happens, it's really to their detriment. So I think we need to think in terms of our planning of how to deal with this. If we're going to a circular economy situation, if we're going to make policies of how to handle e-waste, these are the people that we need to get to the table and sit with them. They are busy. Previously, it was very difficult to do that because the waste pickers are working for themselves. They individually organized. There's huge competition amongst them to get to the waste first because it's their livelihood and they need to do that. But currently, they are starting to get organized because they've realized they cannot negotiate with municipalities, they cannot negotiate with industry if they're not organized. So it's still early days with organization, but I'm glad that it's happening and that they have a voice when it comes to recycling. So we have to respect the position of the informal sector. I think another voice I just want to add to this, and then I will stop there, then you can ask me questions later on if you want to, is the buyback centers. I think we need to focus, we've done some research on the buyback centers, that's the next level in the value chain, because they are critical in the value chain. The waste pickers cannot be there if the buyback centers are not there because they need to sell the waste to somebody. And I think this is where Zaynab will also talk about that, but the buyback centers and the regulations that Susanne was talking about is really critical because it's either makes it very difficult for the buyback centers to exist. Currently, if they recycle plastic or paper, it's no problem. Those people need to be registered, but there's not strict regulations around certain things. But if it comes to e-waste, there's very strict regulations and it makes it very difficult for buyback centers to be part of the process. And I think the buyback centers is our critical step from the waste pickers who collect it. They sell it to the buyback center and then it goes to the in-processors or the big recyclers. And these are the people that we also interact with to understand the value chain and what they mean to the waste pickers, how they deal with them, how they interact with them, the prices they pay, and we need that relationship. We need to nurture that as well. So let me stop there and then you can ask me further questions because I know we're running out of time.
Thank you very much, Rini. So we've heard from Rini and Susanne, and I think we do realize that to a certain extent, South Africa is quite active at the lower end of the value chain where we are trying to collect, and they seem to be drivers, if not for small businesses, but even for the incoming players, the waste pickers, to actually be active in the sector. But we are not yet doing anything significant in as far as end processing is concerned. We speak about beneficiation from a primary mineral resources case, and here we are now speaking about beneficiation from secondary resources case. And I think Zaynab will actually speak to that about, are we able to, or are we in a position to actually start looking at end processing of electronic waste in South Africa? Zaynab is with WWF, the Plastics Circular Economy Desk, and she is a graduate of UCT ChemEng, having done her master's thesis on electronic waste recycling, and she will talk to you about some of the key findings of her research. Over to you, Zaynab.
Thanks, Thandazile, and thanks to Susanne and Rini for really kind of giving the context of the current e-waste recycling system in South Africa. And I think I was going to go into detail in terms of my research findings, and a lot of it has already been raised by Susanne and Prof. Rini. And so I'd rather just like to possibly raise a few additional points, and then we can hand over to the question and answer session. And really this comes down to how we're defining waste. Is it a resource, or are we still looking at it as an environmental liability? And this question comes in again as I work now in the plastic and packaging space. It's the same question. How are we defining these things and how are we looking at it? That will then define the way we legislate, the way we govern certain aspects of the industry, and also whose mandate this fits under. Is it the Department of Environment who manages waste, who manages environmental kind of assessment and safety around that? Or is it the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition, the Department of Science and Innovation? And the answer really is all three. And even the Minerals and Energy Department now comes into it when we're starting to trade secondary metals, because then that comes into the Precious Metal Acts and possibly other acts in the existing legislation, which therefore it brings e-waste into this real kind of sticky situation where it's really not quite understood who governs it and whose mandate it is to kind of really lead the way. Currently it is with the Department of Environment, and we are starting to look at producer responsibility mechanisms, as Susanne mentioned, EPR. And what this will help is for producers or producers of the product, whether it's e-waste, whether it's your electronics, or whether it's packaging, the producer to take accountability for how that resource or that material gets managed at the end of its life. And then it's also a full value chain collaboration. So looking, as Susanne mentioned, we need to look at consumers, we need to look at the retailers, we need to look at the producers, and really get everyone in the value chain to really work together in order for the systems change to happen. And that's what it is. It's redefining the system that we're currently in. We're not just producing products and using them and then disposing of it in landfills. That's the current and old kind of South Africa, and we really need to move into this new circular secondary resource. We need to look into getting our full value of our resources, not continuing to drill into the ground to get more metals. We can, as Susanne mentioned, the mining industry needs to be part of the conversation, because that industry is kind of going down with environmental degradation, but also the resource depletion. And so what happens then? What is the future? And so when Jochen brings up the question of, is recycling worth it? I think that that's a self-answered question. We can't continue to ask that anymore. We need to ask, how are we going to do that? And we need to look at it from a futures and long-term perspective. What systems do we need to put in place in order to get us there? And that's, again, it's full value chain cooperation, full value chain collaboration. And then when it comes to the technology side of things, we also need to think about, is it really worth putting up another smelter for a centralized processing? Are we just sending all of South Africa's e-waste to one location? Is it Johannesburg? Is it Cape Town? Where is it? I think that's no longer should be the question. It's actually about, should we go into decentralization? And so what would that mean for logistics? What would that mean for transport costs? Because in the waste sector, that's currently one of the barriers, is that in some provinces we can recycle one thing when it comes to plastics, and in another provinces it's actually inaccessible because of transport and logistics. And so how can we create a system where it's decentralized? And now I don't have the answer to that, but these are the types of questions we need to answer, especially when we're looking at the informal economy, when we're looking at small to medium enterprises. How can we encourage those to take place within the e-waste recycling sector, and start to kind of, sorry, I lost my train of thought there, but like looking into SMEs and how we can create this decentralized recycling system for them. And then I'll stop there, and hopefully we can have a really good discussion around these questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. No, Zaynab, sorry. We're now going into our Q&A session. We have quite a lot of questions queued up here for us. And before we get into that, I just want to make some comments with regards to, for instance, Suzanne, you spoke about extended producer responsibilities, and Helene-Marie, you spoke about the OEMs being the likely people to address mine waste challenges. And the one question that I wanted to ask was, if we are speaking extended producer responsibility in manufactured goods, who do we consider to be the producer of waste when we speak of the mining industry? And just moving beyond that, when we're now looking at the aspect of SMEs in the electronic waste recycling space, how often is it considered to look at perhaps leapfrogging on already existent businesses? Because we find that startups struggle quite a bit to get going. What happens if we consider existing businesses and try to draw synergies between what they are doing and what different fractions of electronic waste streams could be used for the success of that business? So I will take takers for that as we go. And so the first question to Jenny and Helene-Marie is, have South African mines had about the sustainable management license to operate? Jenny and Helene-Marie, perhaps you would want to, one of you would want to respond to that, or both of you, or anybody else in the audience, you're welcome to raise your hand and give it a shot.
Maybe I can, yes, the social license to operate is of course a huge issue facing the mining. It's actually, I like to talk about the license to operate, which extends to the social and the legislative license to operate, and they're very interrelated, because what we're finding is that increasingly governments are starting to bring in stricter and stricter regulations. I'll put my video on as well, because due to social pressures. So we were starting to see regulations become tighter, and also what's happened now, of course, is in the finance industry, and this came across very strongly at the Mining Indaba. The finance industry has also now starting to respond to this type of pressure, and they brought in this ESG criteria, environmental society governance criteria. So you know what we're seeing, and it's often a spin-off from the social license to operate, that it's starting to affect not only the business's economic or economic viability or viability to operate at all, because it's starting to link to the costs of capital and their availability to capital, as well as their just their legislative right to mine. And we've seen a couple of instances in South Africa where the license the legislative license to operate has not been granted on the grounds of community concerns. So this is a really big issue that we're very aware of, and it's really central to a lot of our research as to this link between environmental and social license to operate and how it impacts on the legal viability as well as the financial viability of mining companies. I don't know if that answers that question.
Okay, thank you, Jenny. Our next questions will go to Zaynab with regards to decentralization and the economies of scale in that regard, that already it is a challenge for South Africa to actually do end processing because of the economies of scale, the challenges to do with economies of scale. Would decentralization still allow for business to be self-sustaining if we took that route?
Thanks for the question. And it's really, I would say there's two components to it, and it's around, as I think Helene-Marie mentioned, these modular recycling operations. Is it possible to do it? And also this depends on which technology we're using. As Susanne mentioned, there's your pyrometallurgy, the hydrometallurgy, and electrochemical processing. And what we've seen in some literature is that there's already these pilot projects for modular hydroprocessing, depending on your feedstock, because as even in Helen's presentation, variability of the feedstock is a problem. And so you'd need kind of a modular approach when it comes to electronic waste and which metals need to be selectively recovered. The second idea is, what about mobile units? So do we need a kind of a stationary facility where we're processing waste, or is it mobile? Does it go around the country by boat or by land? We need to start thinking creatively around this, because it is possible. We don't necessarily need to think of a huge smelter. We can think more of these innovative designs, and then obviously regulations need to be considered, and possibly norms and standards around it, but we need to start and try and really go from there, is just to see what can work and what doesn't have to. And then also another aspect is who owns the technology. So is it possibly multiple use, so multiple users uses that technology by a rental agreement or some sort of agreement where it is a trusted technology, but there can be many users making money from it. So just a few thoughts out there. There are some pilot projects on the ground, and it's really about testing them out and seeing what works and what doesn't.
Thank you very much, Zaynab. So to Helene-Marie, your study focused on coal. Do you have more information on other commodities and their level of success in the implementation of solutions to mine waste to comment at this point?
Okay, so my work has definitely focused on the coal industry, so I can't comment quite widely. I know that, as I mentioned, the waste reprocessors like Sylvania in the platinum and chrome industries, they're reprocessing waste to take some residual mineral value out of it. There are also the associated, one of my respondents was someone from an associated mineral mining industry, but I like to keep these things strictly under wraps, for in case there is only one waste valorization example within that industry, so that you wouldn't be able to pinpoint that person. So yeah, there are a number of examples. Also, like, I think Sasol is a petrochemical. That's the only example that I really know of that's very public, is that they had a really big fly ash dump from their processing of the coal to make petrochemicals, and they were able to develop a brick making technology and give that over to the community, and today they don't have fly ash dumps in that area. So I think there are some good examples of how this has actually been done, and not only in the coal industry, in some other industries as well, but they are few and far between at this point. It's not a general rule in the industry, obviously.
Thank you very much, Helene-Marie. Any other comments from any student or supervisor that's working in the repurposing sector? Megan, Thanos, Sage, do you want to say something?
When it's my turn, it is Harold Anagon. I'd like to make some comments, please.
Go ahead, Harold.
Three different comments. The first, the question to Helene-Marie on the repurposing, for the question from Lindsay. The starting point of your question is referring to mining dumps. Is one of the starting points for transformation within the industry. These material sites are referred to as tailings storage facilities. In legislation, if you refer to them as dumps, they become waste material and subject to all sorts of restrictions of handling. If it's termed as a tailings storage facility, a material that is potentially got further value, it changes its legal status and it changes the attitude towards it. So although dumps is, and I commonly use the word as well when we talk about gold mine dumps, they're in fact not dumps. They're not there to have general ironmongery and other waste thrown in with the sand as a waste repository. Rather, it is strictly controlled as a tailing storage facility. And I'm surprised in Lillian, your obvious response of waste recycling is the removal of the gold mines tailing storage facilities on a massive scale for the last 40 years. Now, it is a matter of scaling. There have been many companies that have started up and failed, but there are 2 or 3 companies, including what is now referred to as Ergo Gold, that is reprocessing dumps on the Central and East Rand, that has now been going for 38 years and has still got a lifetime of more than a decade, and a similar operation started up in the last 3 years to consolidate reprocessing of gold storage tailings facilities on the West Rand. So there is your example. In the area of coal, which was your speciality, is the waste storage facilities are often what are termed to as fines, the material less than 1 or 2 millimeters or 5 millimeters that is difficult to handle, difficult to rewater, has got calorific value, but the energy cost and handling costs to turn it into a valued product is still lacking. It's an area that is being researched a little bit at Northwest University, but is certainly a topic for the MTM program to look at, because I found licensed manufactured technology for separating or enriching coal fines that could be applied to convert coal fines into coal pellets, which would be suitable for a domestic fuel. So the last thing quickly is fly ash from Eskom, and may I recommend that the civil engineers look at geopolymers. These are polymer materials that you could use fly ash waste as a starting material to make ultra strong ceramic materials to replace bricks without requiring firing. So there is a third open research area. Geopolymers are widely used for specialized material, but they could be bulked up to make use of the fly ash, which we have in excess as a byproduct of power generation. That's all from my side. Thank you.
Thank you, Harold. Rini, from your question from Henry, it says COVID-19 response has shown extreme vulnerability of the informal sector in waste picking, but also in other areas. What are the chances of the sector being formalized in this, and will this be viable?
Okay, thank you. I think I can also talk about the next question from Andries Motau.
Yes,
and
you can respond to the questions that came to you.
Both of them. Let me just get my video going again. Thank you. Henry, the situation at the moment is the Department of Environmental Affairs and Linda Godfrey, who's driving the waste roadmap, they have commissioned Dr. Melanie Sampson from BITS 3 years ago, and they started with the process of integrating of the informal sector into the waste economy. So that, I don't know if you're aware of that, but that process is done. It was actually an amazing process that she facilitated, and she did it excellently because she had literally everybody around the table, and that was part of the process where the waste reclaimers were organized. So that document is on the table at the moment, and it needs to be signed off. But as usual, there was a change in ministers, there was a change in directors, so the document is not signed yet. And that will require the municipalities and everybody to actually make the reclaimers part of the processes that are there. I think what is important to mention here is that you talk about formalization, and I think that is sort of a confusing concept. Formalization, this document doesn't speak to formalization in the sense that people should be formally employed. It talks about the integration, meaning that they should become part of all the processes that we are busy with. It spells out what the municipalities, how they should deal and engage with them, make them part of the decision processes, because as we often find, like with the whole Pick It Up story in Johannesburg, they were excluded in decision making, and in the end, many of the things that the Pick It Up were doing in terms of waste collection was actually negative for the waste reclaimers. So, and this document actually speaks about how we should include them in the processes. What came out of these consultations with the waste reclaimers was that they were very clear that they don't want to be formally employed, and they want to work for themselves. They are self-employed, but they want to be supported to become small, medium enterprises. They want to be supported to, they see themselves as entrepreneurs, and they would like to keep the independence, but they would also like to be part of the processes. And I think the document that is on the table and that we were all waiting for to be signed is actually telling us how to facilitate that process. So I hope I'm answering your question, and I think it links to Andres's question as well, to say that this is exactly what will happen, or what should happen, is that the waste reclaimers should be seen as critical in the process. It was interesting, I wanted to say previously, and commented on Susanne's presentation as well, that we get a lot of questions and comments from the developed countries because they don't have an informal sector, and they're very interested in our informal sector and how they are actually the main, as I said previously, the main drivers of our recycling sector. So I think that's a very critical point, and that, yes, of course, it's a logic answer. They should be part of the processes, and we should facilitate that. Can I just make one comment on what Zaynab was saying in terms of decentralization, and it links to the informal sector as well. I want to actually also ask the engineers to think of how can we assist this decentralization process with our technology? Because exactly what Zaynab was saying, we find in the rural areas that there's many people on the dump sites, on the landfill sites, that are also recycling. But one of the big problems that we have is that the rural areas really struggle to recycle because of the fact that it's too far. Our distances, a place like Golfinho is 500 kilometers from Cape Town. So in fact, they cannot really recycle because it's not cost effective to do that. So I think that sort of decentralization processes, innovative ways of how can we do something for smaller areas. What can be done in smaller areas? Can they use it there? Can it be reused, refurbished? We should think broader. I think the whole thing of circular economy type of thing, but what can be done in rural areas? Because there's a vast majority of resources there as well. I just wanted to make that comment. I hope I've answered your questions.
Okay, thank you, Renee. So we will have Helene-Marie and Jenny speak, but Renee, just a comment to you on that end. Has the economic contribution of informal waste collectors or contributors been measured? Is it something that can be used in building a case for the key role they are playing in our economies?
It has been estimated. I don't want to call it measured at this time. I don't want, and this is not measured in terms of electronic waste, but measured in terms of all the waste. And it is estimated that they save landfill space, over 700 million rand of landfill space, because it was determined how much is not going to the landfill that was supposed to go to the landfill. I think we must highlight that South Africa is recycling only 10% currently of what can be recycled. But 90% of that 10% is the estimation. It's not really measured. That is the informal sector.
Okay.
So they do most of the recycling, and that saves landfill space. So that's the only estimation that has been done so far.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much, Renee. And then coming to you, Jenny and Helene-Marie, as you make your comments. So what I'll do is this session ends in 8 minutes. So I will give each of our panelists a session to a moment to close off, and I'll start with Jenny, then Helene-Marie, and Jenny and Helene-Marie, while you have the podium, may I ask that you make comments on the learnings that can, any lessons that have been learned from the reprocessing of gold tailings in the West Rand area in Johannesburg.
Okay,
Jenny.
thank you, Thandazile. Yes, I'd just like maybe to start to respond a little bit to Harold's comments. Thank you, Harold, for those comments. I think it's quite important to point out that, yes, there is quite a lot of waste reprocessing going on in South Africa, mine waste reprocessing, but it's specifically targeted at recovering value. So if you look at sort of maybe, if you're lucky, 1-2 grams per ton is taken out as value. It's PGMs, gold, and even coal. They do take out, they treat the discards to recover the coal through flotation. The bulk of the mined resources, though, they take out the value, and the bulk is redeposited in these sort of waste dumps, if you like. You could, there's a lot of semantics going on around residue deposits and how you term these wastes. A lot of the time you find the mining industry, and particularly with the waste rock, the difference between an actual waste rock and a low-grade ore is an economic definition. And very often these so-called resources dumps, they end up as waste dumps because they're not reprocessed. So there still is this almost cultural hurdle to get over. I was very interested to hear the people talking about e-waste recycling. It's almost sometimes been in competition to primary, its secondary processing being in competition to primary processing and mining. My understanding from some of the meetings I've been to on this at Oxford, and that is that at the moment the secondary sector is not really competing with the primary sector, and a lot of that is due to the need to transport, the costs associated with the transport of large amounts of material, moving a large amount of material around. And I think that the general consensus, trying to have a look at how much raw primary material we need versus how much we can recover from recycling, the consensus that we'll still need mining. I think that I like the idea that the two sort of sectors, as primary and secondary sectors, working more collaboratively. A lot of the processes from the primary industry can be used to recycle, and I think that there's a lot of opportunities there to close the loop, but there'll always be this waste that, and then we've got the waste that can actually be repurposed into other feedstock. So it's a really nice integrated approach if you start to look at it, and I think the key is the 3 C's: collaboration, collaboration, collaboration. It seems to be across sectors, across different primary and secondary industries within sectors. So I think that this is the key to trying to find these more integrated solutions to the problem of waste. So we can indeed head towards zero waste, even if thermodynamically we can never quite get there. We can certainly get close. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jenny. Helene-Marie, you have a minute to give us your closing comments. I have to be a bit stricter with time. We're getting close to 3:30.
That's fine. Yeah, I think just comment, like the gold tailings facility issue is, for me, that's not, I mean, it's reprocessing of the material and it is getting some residual value from it. But if you don't actually then retreat the material and reuse bulk material, you still end up with similar problems. Like a lot of the uranium isn't removed. There's a lot of heavy metals that's not removed. So you still sit with similar problems, waste-related problems, even if they are in super dumps. Also, just a response to Harold on the fine coal. I know that the fine coal has dampness issues, but as far as I'm aware, like there are companies actually doing it right now. I encourage you to go and look for a company called Enprotec, ENPROTEC. They might actually, interest you if you're interested in this. Thank you.
Thank you, Helene-Marie. Rini, your closing comments.
Just here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I want to answer Jochen's question. So do we have to recycle, or should we recycle? We have to recycle. I don't know what's going to happen to all the informal sector if we don't recycle. If it's economically viable, that I think we need to talk about, and then what is needed to make it economically viable, because at the moment it depends on global prices. And I think we also have to think of markets in South Africa. I think that's what Susanne was also referring to, that we have a problem that we don't have the market or the factories that can deal with the reusing, refurbishing. And I think that should be developed in South Africa very strongly so that we can keep on recycling.
Thank you very much, Rini. And Zaynab, your closing comments. Zaynab?
Unfortunately, I think she's had to, her and Susanne have both had to leave the meeting for another meeting. But I would Thandazile, do you have any closing comments to make?
No, it's already 15:29. In the interest of time, I think we need to thank all our presenters that are still online and our audience, and I will hand over to you, Aisha to close off the meeting. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Thandazile, for hosting us and making the conversation incredibly engaging. I really appreciated the session. Just to check, if anyone is interested in being added to the mailing list, please send me a message with your email address and I'll add you now. Otherwise, thank you so much for joining us, and we'll have another session tomorrow, well, not tomorrow, next week, Wednesday, and we'll be discussing sustainable development and a route towards it. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Aisha and Thandazile. Very good hosting. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all for a fantastic seminar. All women. I'm impressed.
I didn't notice that, but you're right.
Thank you all and cheers.
Thank you for joining.
Fantastic, Aisha.
Thank
you.
Thanks for joining us.